These are devotions for people at a social distance. Recently, my devotions have taken me into the book of Daniel, which of course is full of these amazing, wonderful stories. And one of the ones that seems to be particularly applicable to where we are right now is the story of the writing on the wall. So we have the king of the Babylonians. He is having this wonderful feast. Everything is great, right? They're celebrating their kingdom. And all of a sudden, this human hand appears and it begins writing on the plaster of the wall in the royal palace. And this is obviously a big disturbing sign, and the king immediately wants to know who can read this for me, who can interpret this. And so he says this: whoever can read this writing and tell me its interpretation shall be clothed in purple and have a chain of gold around his neck and rank third in the kingdom. And the amazing thing that happens next is, of course, is that all the king's wise men are brought in, and they cannot read the writing. They cannot tell the king what it means. And this is rather the curious thing about the story, because you see, the writing is just everyday common words in the Aramaic language that would have been the common language in the Persian Empire at that time. The words, we are told a bit later, are mene, mene, tekel, and parsin. And anyone could have read them, right? Pretty obviously, these are everyday words. They mean numbered, weighed, and divided, as we find out later. So how is it that these great wise men of the empire cannot read everyday common words? Well, is it that they are perhaps a little bit too wise? Is it perhaps that the interpretation is a little bit too obvious, too clear, and that basically the interpretation is far too dangerous? Because as Daniel comes in, and right away he describes it, he says, well, God has numbered the days of your kingdom, numbered, brought them to an end. Tekel, you've been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and then the Persians. It's not a huge stretch to come up with that interpretation, but it's exactly the kind of interpretation, of course, that the king doesn't want to hear. He does not want to hear that his kingdom is teetering on the brink. And I suspect even, this isn't just something that's obvious from the words on the wall, from the so-called writing on the wall. This is obvious, any wise person looking around sees that the kingdom of Babylon is kind of teetering on the brink. In particular, because what happens is the day after this event, the kingdom falls to the Persians. Well, the only way that's going to happen is, of course, if the Persians are sort of waiting outside the walls. The writing's on the wall. The kingdom is coming down. Your enemies are going to destroy you. And they didn't want to deal with that. They didn't want to. They were throwing a feast. They were throwing a party because they did not want to deal with the fragility of their world. What does it take to be a prophet? Not necessarily great insight, not necessarily, the wisdom to find obscure words and obscure meanings and obscure interpretations of text. No, sometimes being a prophet is just seeing what's obvious and having the courage to say it. And that's what Daniel does in this story. There's a lot of things that I think applies to where we are today. Our society is fragile. This pandemic has shown up the fragility of our society. We have been pushed to the brink, and unless we do things like take care of some of the weakest among us, some of the people who are suffering worse from this pandemic have not been given the priority in terms of vaccinations and protections, because powerful people, influential people are gobbling up the resources. And if we don't address that, guess what? Mene, mene, tekel, peres. Lord our God, let us see the writing on the wall. Let us have the courage to face up to it. Amen.